Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the Royal College of Surgeons live feed for a webinar on how to get published. My name's Tim Lane. I'm Editor-in-Chief of the Annals for the Royal College of Surgeons. I'm also Chairman of the Court of Examiners and an invited member of Council. And tonight with me, I've got two colleagues who are going to hopefully give us a real-world feel to getting published, and I'll let them introduce myself. So on my left is Alex.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex Hampson. I'm the Research Fellow at the Lister Hospital in Stevenage.
And on my right is Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew Buzentil. I'm a Specialist Registrar of ST6 and Vascular Surgery at the Royal Free and UCH, and I've done some research in the past as a Research Fellow.
Excellent. So before I start, I'm just going to make a couple of acknowledgements. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today is actually writing a good paper. If you write a good paper, you're much more likely to get that good paper accepted. So I'm going to acknowledge that a lot of this comes from a course which was run here at the college on how to write a surgical paper. It was really the brainchild of Derek Alderson, who's currently president of the college, and a collaboration when he was Editor-in-Chief of the British Journal of Surgery and the RCS Education Department. The course was run by my predecessor, Colin Johnson, who was formerly Editor-in-Chief of the Annals. So I acknowledge them and thanks for a lot of the material in the course. Where are we this evening? We're in the Nuffield building, which is just to the left of the college. It seemed a little bit better than this, because this is all that remains currently of the Royal College of Surgeons. This is the bit that's standing, so as you probably all know, it's undergoing a major refurbishment. With us this evening as well is Jan and Ed from the RCS events team. They're on the left, and they're going to be passing on all your questions to us later on this evening. So they're behind the scenes, busy sorting everything out. So I'll just go through briefly what we're going to cover this evening. First is why we write a paper, what we can write about, and really go through the basics of writing an academic paper. We'll touch on aspects of authorship, about selecting the most appropriate journal for your submission. Talk a little bit about impact factors and the thorny issue of dealing with revisions and rejection, as well as aspects of dual publications and plagiarism. Writing a paper is all about practice. When you start off, you're scratching away at a piece of paper for many days, if not weeks. The more papers you write, the better you get at it. It's a bit like evolution. Eventually, and in some occasions, you can get turned to the dark side. What do I mean by that? Well, you go and become an editor. So this is me, and I took over as Editor-in-Chief of the Annals 5 years ago, and it's been around for about 70 years. It was started by a chap called Sir Cecil Whately, a former president of the college. He was a remarkable man in many ways. He rebuilt the college physically after the Second World War, and he started the Annals. And it was really, he did this because he was very keen on encouraging junior surgeons to write papers, and he saw this as a good conduit for their academic work. So a lot of what we do today is really based on what he wanted us to do 70 years ago, and I think we hold true to his principles. I thought this time, before we start, I'd show you one of my early papers. So this is almost 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago. And so this was in a previous incarnation when I was still a surgical registrar, and a young 16-year-old girl came into casualty with a 2-year history of intermittent abdominal pain and a diagnosis of urinary retention because she had a suprapubic swelling. Well, she was in retention, but what she did have was a wandering spleen. Now, as most of you will know, the spleen sits normally nicely up in the left upper quadrant, and it's stuck there and it doesn't do much else. But in embryonic development, if it doesn't fuse with the posterior abdominal wall, it's left to wander around the abdomen on a long mesentery. It's chronically twisted, giving her intermittent abdominal pains. And so I wrote it up at the time as one of the first papers I'd done, and it got published. I didn't realise at the time, but the reason it got published was because this was about management Most cases were patients presenting with an infarcted spleen, but this was a paper which described how you manage it. And Mari South, who was my boss in Maidstone in Kent, formed a little pouch in the left upper quadrant with mesh, and she put the spleen in it, and the patient made an uneventful recovery. So there were two things. We had a decent picture and we had something practical to tell. So that was my first paper. What about yours, Alex? What was yours?
Well, my first paper I ever wrote is still in review.
Oh, right. Not with me, I hope.
No. But as with everything, it's about practice. And since then, I've had multiple different ones published.
Okay.
Main ones being simple things like case reports, and comments, and literature reviews.
Okay. And Andrew, what about you?
So my first paper I published was a systematic review, which took a long time, and seeing how many systematic reviews I've done since.
So that wasn't an easy.
It wasn't an easy one, and hopefully people can learn from my misfortune, so to speak. So that was that as a research fellow.
Okay, great. So that was a relatively easy entry for me, and I suppose the question everybody asks is, why do I need to write a paper? And I'd like to think that most of us write it still, even nowadays, for the right reasons. And it's by publishing papers, especially clinically based papers, that we, as I wrote here in my first editorial 5 years ago, that we get to learn from the successes and our failures. And we only do that with as a result of the honest and candid dissemination of surgical results. So if we have successes, we can learn from them. If we have failures, we can also learn from them. And so I think both of those are very good reasons to write papers. So what are we going to, why are we going to write a paper? Well, we're going to share our experiences and hopefully advance surgical care. That's improve outcomes for patients. But we've got to be honest, most people, I suspect, who are tuning in this evening to this webinar know that it's important to distinguish yourselves from your peers, especially when you're coming up to core or higher surgical training interviews, because it is an important part of the selection process. It scores points on a shortlisting criteria. It's an important part of your portfolio. And if you tuned in earlier on to the webinar on portfolios, then you will know that's a significant part of your portfolio, and you can access on the Royal College website. Some people will have distinct academic career aspirations, and they know that's going to be a part of their life. If you're already a higher surgical trainee and you think you've got away with not writing any papers, well, it's coming to get you. Most of the curricula are in the middle of being revised at the moment. It's very likely that the minimum criteria will be that you have to have at least 2 first authored papers. And so if you want an outcome 6 at the end of your training and your all-important CCT, you will have needed to have done proven yourself in that field. So that's why it's important, even if you're a high surgical trainee. But I think the most important thing is that whatever you do, whether you want to write another paper in your life after you become a consultant or not, you're going to have to continually read papers as part of CPD and continuing professional development. And that means you have to make a critical appraisal of the information in the literature. And really, the only way you're going to do that and really take it, really understand it, is if you've had some experience of writing a paper yourself. So, most important thing people ask us normally is well, actually, how on earth do I go about finding something to write about in the first time? They know they have to write a paper, they want to get on and do it, but how do you start? And the important thing is consider your immediate clinical environment. The Europeans refer to it as planned happenstance. In other words, there are always things around you, you just don't often see them. You may be working in a small DGH, but you can ask yourself, well, what works well in this department and what could work well somewhere else? Can I share or disseminate this knowledge? Perhaps you've seen just a point of technique, something your boss does, and you're thinking, well, that's a good way of doing it, and you haven't seen it before. That can sometimes be written up as a point of technique. You may be in a department which is introducing an innovative procedure, and you can review the outcomes of that. Is there a different way in which care is delivered? I've had some excellent papers submitted through the Annals where departments have had particular issues with the numbers of follow-up patients, and they've introduced virtual clinics, telephone clinics, and the like. And that's been something that's been able to share with other departments through the publication. Sometimes if you have a particular challenge in a department and you've managed to overcome it, then it's very likely that another department in another part of the country will be facing those same challenges. And you can share how you've managed to overcome those difficulties. And the most important thing is trying to distinguish your submission from everybody else's to make it stand out. So this is what you can write about. I think the easiest thing to start with is always case reports. Why a case report? Well, it's something you can do on your own. You've seen the case, you know the history, you can do the literature research. You don't really need to incorporate lots of other people in on the study. So it's something you can do very much on your own, perhaps with your boss or a senior author. And so it's a very good entry level because you can go away and you can do it on your own, and you can submit it, and all these things have pretty good turnaround times. It may be that there's a number of cases you've seen which have all been a bit similar, and you could perhaps collect together a common theme. If you're lucky enough to be involved with a prospective trial, then you're really hitting the major league in terms of research. If you do a specific period of research, which we'll come on to later, you may be doing some laboratory-based research. But ultimately, you don't actually need to be doing any clinical work to write a paper. You could be writing review articles, meta-analyses, or editorials, or even responding to letters to the editors. I don't know what my colleagues think about here. What's the easiest thing in a busy clinical job, do you think, to pick in terms of writing papers?
Well, I think, like you said, a case report's a very good starting block, especially coming straight from medical school, where you're used to writing up your cases just to present them to other people. It's a very similar thing to take something that's actually interesting and benefit to other people, and just turning it into a piece of literature that you can submit. It then leads you on to, like you say, turning that into something slightly bigger, or getting you used to writing papers.
Yeah. And Andrew, so you're a more senior trainee now, and you're working in some teaching hospitals recently, and so in many ways these are tertiary centres. You're operating in a slightly more esoteric fashion. What would your be advice to hire surgical trainees?
Well, higher surgical trainees could have the opportunity to be exposed to more, different types of procedures. I think being involved in clinical trials at that stage is quite handy because you have more know-how, you tend to be a bit more organized, and you have less admin work or less work to do with regards to ward work as a higher specialist trainee. At the end of it, I think taking time out to do a lab-based project or a review or run a trial, I think is beneficial in the long term.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to come back to that a bit later on, because that's taking time out to do research is an important thing. But of course, if you're going to write a paper, the most important thing is to write a decent paper, and most papers get rejected at first review because they don't make or meet those basic criteria. So we're just going to run through, and these slides will be up on the website, so you can always review them later. But I'm just going to run through about writing a paper. Now, the abstract, this is probably in many ways the most important part of your paper. To be frank, it may be the only bit of your paper that anybody ever reads, because people are going to skim this. And if you've submitted a paper for a review, that's the first thing the editor's going to read. And if he doesn't like it, he may well bin it at that stage. It's also the most difficult thing to write. So the last thing you do on your paper is to write the abstract, because it really is a précis of the whole paper. So it's best written last, and after your whole paper has been completed. It has to be very carefully structured. You can give a brief description of all parts of your paper, but everything must be in the article. You can't put something in the abstract which isn't in the main body of the paper. You don't put in any references, and essentially it's a very brief summary of the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. But this is your window for your paper. This is what everybody will see. Even if it's published, it may be the only thing that people actually read. So this is the most important part of your paper in many ways. The introduction is really setting the scene for your paper. This is a way of selling your paper to an editor or a journal because you're going to explain the rationale for your study and why it's important. You're going to describe whatever intervention you're writing about and put it in its historical context. So if you're introducing a new robotic procedure, you can outline the potential benefits and drawbacks of this new intervention. But you've got to state the aims of your study quite clearly. In other words, are you aiming to reduce inpatient stay, reduce blood loss, improve functional outcomes? These are your endpoints, which you need to make very clear, and you do this in your introduction. And you're also selling, if you like, or demonstrating the originality of this intervention. And you're really going to explain that this is something worthwhile being tested. Because if you can't convince anybody in the introduction that this intervention is going to be worthwhile, then your paper is going to fail at an early stage. It also gives you a chance to demonstrate the scientific credibility of the whole endeavour. The methods, this is the bread and butter of any paper. You've got to describe very well and very clearly and simply who the study subjects are, the study design, the methods you used, and don't even bother sending your paper in if you haven't put in an addendum which says this received institutional ethical approval. It's just an absolute must because no journal will take this unless you've had ethical approval for it. It's got to be statistically sound, and then any study will involve this at an early stage, so that's a very important bit, and a lot of papers fall down on the statistical analysis and the appropriate powering of studies. So that's something you need to make very clear in your methods as well. The results, the biggest problem with most people who send in papers with results is it's very wordy. There needs to be very little writing in the results section. It should essentially just be tables and figures, and they should really dominate the whole paper. You don't really need to repeat what you've put in a table in writing because there's no need for it. But you can concentrate on those specific relevant data that you want to highlight and concentrate on that new knowledge that you bring out in the study. So it's not a repetition, and it's mostly figures, graphs, and tables that should dominate in your results section. The discussion, this is the bit where you get to wax lyrical. Okay, this is the bit where you're going to draw attention to those particular results that you want everybody to notice. So it gives you the opportunity to interpret the results, and you emphasize those primary endpoints like reduced blood loss, shorter inpatient stay, better functional outcomes. These are the things you've brought up in your introduction and methods, which you're now going to reflect upon. Now you've got your results section done and dusted. And that's where you really start to draw your conclusions. You get a chance to compare it with the existing literature, but it's also a chance for you to acknowledge some of the potential weak points of the study. And it's much better that you point out your weak points, perhaps more gently, than an editor asking you to highlight it in perhaps more robust fashion. So don't think you're going to hide anything from the editor and the reviewers. So this is a good opportunity to acknowledge that you've reflected on your study, that there are inevitably some weaknesses for it, and you've highlighted them yourself. Authorship's often actually more tricky than you imagine. It's an important part of the submission. Unfortunately, it's not an opportunity for you to add all your friends and every consultant in your department, your second cousin, your Auntie Lil. They're not going to go on the paper, okay? They have to have had a record and played an active part in the process. I've seen case reports submitted with, I think the record was 19 names on. Okay, I think it was the whole department, on the basis that everybody had seen a patient on the ward for at least one day during her inpatient stay. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. You have to define everybody's role. If you've written the paper, that's fine, your name's on the paper. If you've asked someone to review the manuscript and adjust it, that's also fine. But you can't ask another 5 people also to review the manuscript because that goes just beyond what's acceptable. But you will be asked to justify the role of every author. And in putting your name in a paper, you take equal responsibility for that paper. And some very senior clinicians have really come a cropper in the past because their name have gone on to publications where perhaps they hadn't seen the details, and this is sort of so-called courtesy publication, and there have been some very significant consequences to otherwise unblemished careers. So it is very important that if your name goes on that paper and you sign the form, that you know everything about that paper. So that's the importance of being involved at every stage of a paper. Authorship is potentially very important. Selecting the most appropriate journal, that's easy. You send it to the Annals of the Royal College of Surgeons. It's clearly the best journal there, and I would recommend you try us first as the premier journal in the UK. All right, perhaps I'm just plugging the Annals a little bit. But it is the biggest mistake people make. Some people will actually write a fantastic paper and then they send it to a journal where there's absolutely no chance that they're going to publish it because it falls outside their publishing pattern. In other words, if you're doing something in serum, rhubarb, this, that, or the other, it's not necessarily going to be published in a clinical journal. And so you have to have actually read the journal in the first place. And in fact, we were talking about this earlier. And Alex, you have a little scheme about this. You've got copies of papers.
I've got copies of papers, and I've got a spreadsheet that's full of every PubMed indexed urological journal and which type of papers they take, because not every paper will take case reports, for example.
Yeah.
So if I've written a case report, there's no point sending it to one of those journals that doesn't take it.
Yeah.
So I can then filter based upon the paper that I've written, which ones are suitable, and then I go to that journal and I look and see what sort of things they have and what sort of information they're trying to get across to their readers. Is this something that they want to be telling? Is this the story, the information they want to be putting across?
What about you, Andrew? Do you have a sort of a list of favourite journals you're going to submit to, and have you got an idea about
The Annals.
what's likely after the
Annals, obviously? So there are a list of journals which are more inclined to publish work on venous research, which is what my main topic of research was, and then you kind of get a flavour for what type of articles they accept. I admit I'm not as organized as Alex, have a spreadsheet and identify the journals per se, but as part of the writing process, we start thinking about what journal this will get to pretty early on, so we start focusing it towards that.
Yeah, I think certainly in my experience from the Annals, there are certainly people who have submitted and clearly don't know what we normally publish. It's a very clinically based research journal, and it's clear that they haven't even read it, and it's a shame because those papers are rejected. And having a paper rejected doesn't mean it's a bad paper. Sometimes it's just fallen outside the publishing remit. The other thing that a lot of people will perhaps stress over more than they need to is impact factors of individual journals. The honest answer is very few of us will be lucky enough to have a Nature or a Lancet publication. But I think a more important question is, when you're thinking about submitting a paper for publication, is who do you want to read the paper? Do you want 30,000 surgeons in the United Kingdom to read your paper? If the answer is yes, you submit it to the Annals. Okay, who are your peers? Well, they're the people who are going to read your paper. They're the people who will be interviewing you. They're the people who you may well be working with collaboratively in the future. So I think it's just as important to know who your readership is. because it may well get published in a journal which nobody will effectively read. So it is about disseminating it to your peers, as well as getting it published in an important journal. Perhaps one of the thorny issues is when you submit a paper and it's not rejected, but you get some comments back from the editorial team saying, well, actually, we think this is a good paper, but we think it could be a bit better if you make some changes. And of course, for some people, after this carefully crafted work of yours, and to have someone criticize some parts of it doesn't go down very well. But it's not meant to be an adversarial process. These revisions are really there to make the publication better. The reviewers, the associate editors, they're the gatekeepers. They're really there to stop you making a complete plonker of yourself publicly. So if you've made an error in your paper, they're going to correct it for you. And the best way you do that is by taking each of the points that they've responded to, and you make a point-by-point response to the issues raised. And so you copy and paste each point, you put in your reply, and then you change the text and you track all those changes, because there's absolutely no point in changing those changes, because I can promise you now, I don't have time to look at both copies and work out where you've made those changes. So you need to highlight those, the changes you've made to the original submission. And you need to do that within a reasonable time period. There's no point 18 months later sending us back saying, I've made the changes, because often someone else has written a paper which may have been better than yours and is now published, and that's not going to get in. And for many people, if their papers aren't accepted, they often send the complete paper to a different journal, unamended, and often with the title of the previous journal they've submitted to. It really happens, I promise you. So if you are going to resubmit your paper, because it has been declined by one journal, make sure you check the requirements for the next journal you're going to be submitting it to make sure it reaches all the requirements. So this is just basic housekeeping, but it's very important, and it is the reason why the vast majority of papers are perhaps rejected without review. Dual publication, plagiarism, and aspects like that. I have to say, when I took over as editor-in-chief of the Annals, I thought I wouldn't ever see any of this. Sadly, it happens, and sometimes it becomes as a result of a little, perhaps, over-enthusiasm. You've got a great paper, you think you're going to be very generous, and you're going to offer it to a number of journals to review your paper all at the same time. Problem for you is if more than one of those journals accept your paper, they're going to want to know why you've then withdrawn your paper at the last minute. It's certainly unethical to do that, and it can have some serious consequences. Likewise, salami slicing. What's salami slicing? Salami slicing is when you submit a paper on the outcome of 200 patients who have had a novel procedure. You submit it to one journal. Next week, you've done 202 cases, and you submit it to another journal talking about the outcomes of those 202 patients, and you've guessed it, the week after, there's another submission on the outcome of 203 people. There's not a huge difference between the two. That's salami slicing, and that's looked on rather poorly. You've also got to be careful when you're writing papers that you don't inadvertently copy and paste large sections of other people's work. It can happen almost inadvertently when you're reading other papers and reviews, because every paper that's submitted to every journal nowadays goes through a software processing program, and it will pick up very subtle phrases that it will have picked up from other journals and published papers, and they will get flagged up. And I regularly get papers sent through to me about papers in which direct quotations have been made from other papers. So you have to have made that declaration at the time of submitting a paper that it hasn't been submitted elsewhere. You've got to make sure that there's no conflict of interest. If you've got a commercial interest in a new device and you're writing a paper about it, then that's clearly a very significant conflict of interest, as well as the research ethics I mentioned earlier. So I'm just going to sort of summarize now about what we've been talking about, and then we'll go on to take some questions and see if we can help. I think in summary, you should concentrate on your immediate clinical placement for ideas. That's going to be the most fruitful place of finding things to write about. Carefully select the journal, and you should tailor your paper according to that journal's specific requirements. It makes that editor feel loved. It knows that you've written it in accordance with their requirements and that clearly you had their interests at the top of your mind all the time. And you've got to ask yourself, who do you want this to read this? There's no point in putting all this work into something if you're going to send it to a journal where actually none of your peers will ever see this. It becomes a worthless piece of publication. And you've got colleagues. Ask your colleagues to read this. Ask your senior colleagues to read this. Get them to read it and reread your drafts. That's the way papers get better. If you do get asked to make revisions, deal with them quickly and honestly and in a non-adversarial fashion. And if you're unfortunate and you're unsuccessful, then actually you can ask for some polite feedback because if that's going to help, you'll find that most associate editors and reviewers will pass on some help to see if we can improve your paper. What you don't do is simply say, right, well, didn't get into that one, I'll send it to the next journal. All right, you need to look at that next journal and make sure you make some changes and you change it to fit in with the requirements of that new journal. So I think that's enough of me talking. Anything about writing a paper that you'd like to mention, anything that you've found or you've learned over the years?
One thing which really helped me is pay attention to the instructions by the journal, especially when it comes to actually submitting the format that needs to be submitted. They may seem like very pedantic ways of doing things, but it's really important and it shows you care about the process, and it kind of puts you at an equal footing with many other people supplying their research to that journal.
Okay, and what about you? Anything you found particularly useful?
I think as well, when you get rejected, ask for that feedback, because it's part of applying, it's part of doing it, is to get that feedback back and making those changes. That's why my first paper still be resubmitted, because it's taking new forms every time.
Yeah.
And while you may get revisions back on some papers, revisions are really helpful because you can listen to that response and make those changes immediately and get them back again.
Okay.
But doing it quickly, honestly, and listening to that response is important. If you just say, actually, I don't agree with that, send it back again and put it again, it's not going to change anything.
No. Okay, so now we're going to go on to some questions. So you get to ask us some direct questions now, and if I keep clicking on this. So this is the first question that's come through this evening. It says, I'll read it out for you because I don't think you can see these slides. And so if you're at home, you can now maximise us. It's quite frightening. You can take the slides away. We're at full Technicolor, and you can always tone it down if it's a bit too frightening. But anyway, so the first question's come through. It says, I've not written a paper before. What would you suggest I start with? I think you can start with anything, but I think, as I said earlier on in the talk, that a case report is always the best way, because actually it needs very little collaboration. It's something you can do almost entirely on your own, and you can write it, you can do the research for it, you can find a senior colleague to present it with, and it's a relatively short process as well. It's not, you're not going to invest a huge amount of time for something that may not pay dividends, and it certainly gets you off the starting point. I'm not sure, would you agree?
I would. I'd just say start with something.
Yeah.
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid of saying, oh, I've never published before, I've never written a paper before. You never write a paper until you've written a paper.
I think the most frequent thing I have is people saying, I haven't got any papers. And I ask them, how many have you written? And they say, I've not written any. If you haven't written any, if you haven't had any rejected, you've not made that start. And that's the most important thing. So I think for the person who sent this question in, I'd say start with something simple. Start with the case report, something you've got entire control over, and then you can learn the ropes. So go on to the next one. So this one, it says, how do you get statistics support as a UK trainee with no funds or time allocated to research? That's a very good question, because it is quite difficult. I know when I was in a similar situation, I emailed a local university and simply asked, was there anybody who could help? And the person who replied saying, well, actually, no, I can't. But one of our junior lecturers would be happy to be involved, and this was about appropriately empowering a study. And so long as you give them due recognition when you write the paper, you'll find that many of these people are very happy to help out. What about you, Alex? What have you done with your statistics?
Well, I've done a whole range of things. I remember for one of my first papers, I wrote an email to my old university and said, I used to be a medical student here, to the library board clerk actually, and said, is there anything you can do to help?
Yeah.
I've spoken with other universities that I've had no affiliations with, just to say, need a bit of help. I've taught myself some, because as you go through your career, you're going to need stats in all walks of life, and especially reading other people's work.
Yeah.
You understand what they've been doing and why they've been doing it, and you see actually some papers that you think actually they're not doing their analysis right.
Yeah.
And then you're learning for your own sake. You're not just learning for this or getting somebody else to do the work for your paper.
What about you, Andrew? Do you have any favourite statistics programs? Or
I taught myself how to use SPSS, and taught myself because it was there.
so what's SPSS? Just for those who don't understand.
So SPSS is a software which allows you to put data in and compute all sorts of different statistical tests, be it plain and simple statistics to quite complex ones, and gives you very good output graphs and tables, and as well as calculating p-values. So
And people can access this online.
So they can access, SPSS needs a license, so it needs to be bought, but there are lots of other different types of software which are open license and don't need to be paid for, and it's a matter of looking what's out there. There's a wealth of information on the web, and actually having SPSS doesn't mean you can do all the statistics. You actually need to know how to do that. And I taught myself using a lot of web tutorials and
Okay, so I think whoever asked the question is going to be disappointed with the answer, which is learn some statistics. That's not the answer you probably wanted. But I think there is support out there, and you just need to go and approach people. And I think so long as you give them due recognition in a final paper, they're very happy. But it does sound like there's quite a few statistics programs out there, and you can access those, which should help your thing. In fact, you'll find many journals actually are quite happy to help with that as well.
Yeah, there are. I know a couple of journals I've emailed have said, actually, if you do it this way, that's all you need for this type of paper. And even if you don't have access to complex stats programs like SPSS, even simple things like Excel spreadsheets, they will do. You can learn very simple statistics using that. It will give you chi-squared functions. It will give you students' tests. You will be able to do it all.
Yeah.
And the thing about Excel is you can put it in the way that you've done it, as opposed to SPSS, which is
quite rigid.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'd only add in that you need to be careful about the statistics as well. So it's not there to hide data. The classic one is 1/3 of the mice recovered, 1/3 of the mice died, and the other one escaped. Okay. You don't want to present this in a slightly sort of hidden fashion. Okay, all right. Well, we'll move on to the next question. Okay, well, this is a heavyweight question. So this is, what are your thoughts on reducing publication bias, particularly in relation to institutional hierarchy, good old nepotism, or academic rivalry? The honest answer is I don't think it does exist anymore. Most of the submission and review process is so transparent nowadays that all a reviewer may get is the title of the paper without the academic institution, and sometimes some journals won't even have the authors on there. So in many ways it doesn't arise. Editors are very good at distancing themselves from any direct contact, and there are often associate editors within journals who will make final decisions if the editor-in-chief feels there's any conflict of interest. So I think, although that may well have been a problem in the past, I think with the transparent review process which happened through most journals nowadays, I'm not sure that actually that happens to any significant extent. Okay, let's hope there's an easier one. Do you have to get published to get a higher surgical training post? The answer is absolutely yes. Why? Well, if you're a core surgical trainee, it's a significant part of your portfolio. For anybody who's currently looking at an application form for core surgical training, then there are points allotted to papers you have published. As I mentioned a bit earlier on, if you're a higher surgical trainee already and you think you don't have to write a paper, you're going to get a big shock when you come up to your final ARCP and you're hoping to get your outcome 6, because they're going to be looking more often than not for 2 first authored papers. Alex, you're looking to apply for core surgical training, but have you seen the application form yet?
Yeah. So you can find the application forms quite easily online, and actually you can find the application forms for whatever specialty you're thinking of going for. And I'd say not just aiming for the basics for core surgical, think about where you want to be going.
Yeah.
Well, yes, you can get some points for the core surgical stuff, think further long term as well. I think it's worthwhile doing.
Yeah. And what about Andrew? So JCST, if you look on their website for vascular surgery, do you know what their requirements are?
So their requirements are the 2 papers as first author, along with all the other work-based assessments and everything else you need to be doing. And I think as a higher surgical trainee, having done research, it kind of comes a bit more naturally, and you're in a better position to help supervise others do it as well. So you can have quite a few projects going on whilst having a busy clinical attachment just the same. So as you progress, things get easier. And my advice to whoever is watching is speak to the friendly registrar, because they've got a lot of ideas, or the one of the consultants.
So speak to your team, and the answer is sadly yes.
Definitely.
So this is a good question. So I work in a small DGH. It's difficult to find anything to write about. How can I compete with a teaching hospital trainee? What do you suggest? Well, I would argue actually that most of the better papers that I've written have come when I've been working in a district general hospital, because it's not all about a very rare procedure or something very esoteric. The most significant impacts are things that affect everybody. Some of the best papers I've seen recently through the annals were units where they had significant follow-up problems, and they had solved those by running virtual clinics, telephone clinics, where patients didn't necessarily have to return to the hospital for routine results and things. There was an excellent paper this year from a higher surgical trainee who looked at the outcomes from laparotomies over the weekend and during the week. Most of you will know that Jeremy Hunt suggested that there was a significant weekend effect. And someone looked at in a large district general hospital about whether or not that really was the case, and it wasn't. And this was very powerful evidence to say, well, actually, that's not the case. And so all these papers came from district general hospitals because they had the volume, and volumes means bigger numbers and more statistical confidence. So I think actually in many ways that you don't need to think research is just for people in teaching hospitals. There is a wealth of data in district general hospitals, and I would use those.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's see what's next. So are there any tips for someone not currently in a surgical training post or attached to a surgical department who's looking for opportunity to become involved with the project? So Alex, what do you do if you're not actually in a surgical department? Perhaps you're a foundation trainee and you are trying to beef up your portfolio with a surgical publication, but you're working for care of the elderly team.
Well, I'd say that's the perfect time to write a paper. If you're on a non-surgical job, you've probably more than likely got more time to write that paper in the first place.
We'll keep it non-confidential.
Okay, well, what I would suggest is going to find a surgical team. make that first step of introduce yourself to a registrar, a consultant, explain that you're looking to do some work. As Andrew said earlier, most registrars have ideas about what they want to be doing, they just don't have the time to do it. If you're there and you're keen and you're putting yourself forward, you'll find that there's people there who are willing to help you and are willing to put this plan into action.
And what do you think? So if someone came along to your team, and normally it's the case where actually there are more ideas around than people free to do the work.
It certainly is the case, and we often get either junior doctors or medical students coming to us, and we have a list of projects. You're taking this one because this is here. We want to know this. This is important, A, for our clinical practice, and B, we think it's going to add to the volume of knowledge on this particular subject. Just today, we're walking from one hospital to another to go to an MDT. Myself and one of the senior consultants, we got 3 ideas for projects. Constantly typing down on our phone as we walk, just to get lists of things done. So yes, come and speak to us, and we'll get you sorted.
I think, as you'll see from that earlier slide about things you can write, you don't always have to be dealing with immediate clinical data. Sometimes you've got time, you want to review a particular question, you can write a review article, and they're often very informative. And you don't necessarily need to be part of a team to write that. And as Andrew suggested, if there is a particular area of controversy, if you were to be the one to go away and research it, look up all the papers and present the data, then that would make a very worthy publication. Okay, let's see. Someone else. So someone else has said, is it important that I undertake a formal research degree to get published? Well, that's a good one to ask Andrew, because Andrew, you're due to defend your PhD soon, aren't you?
So I am. So for me, I found it very important because it helped me. It gave me the skills, the support from colleagues, support from a dedicated academic supervisor. It doesn't have to be the case. It's just the way I am made, I guess. I found it a good opportunity to do so, and as a result, it's given me a very good grounding for academia to carry this on, even on a part-time basis. I don't see myself as an academic per se, but I enjoyed my time doing research. It was very busy, but it gives you a lot of skills, and ultimately, yes, for me it was important to help me get published, if I have to put it that way. But it isn't the be-all and end-all, so I don't want you to think if you're not doing a research degree you don't get any publications, because it's not the case.
Well, Alex is a good example. So Alex has done foundation training, and it's fair to say you're considering perhaps going to follow an academic route. So you've taken a little bit of time out now to do some clinical work and to do some research. So that's a sort of a halfway house, but it is really for you to see how you want to pursue your career.
Yeah, it was a bit to find out and to dip my toe, if you will, into the academic life, to the research life. Yeah. I'd say it wasn't necessarily important to have a formal research degree, but it is most certainly important to dedicate your time to it. This isn't something that you can just spend a half day doing once every so often and come out with what you want. It's something that you've got to put the time into. Yeah. And for me, that meant taking a year out to work on it. Yeah. Now, I didn't want to lose all my clinical skills, so I didn't undertake a full degree, but I said actually half of my week is going to be dedicated to research work. Yeah. And it most certainly has paid off.
And nowadays, you can, with whether it's a foundation, core, or even higher surgical training, there are specific academic routes where you can incorporate PhDs, MDs, and things like that in. So, so if someone does want to do a specific period of formal research, then that's another route to incorporate that in with your, combine it with your surgical training. Okay, so some journals will publish your paper, whatever the quality, for a fee. What do you think of this? Well, it's a good question. And the answer is there are certainly some journals, if you submit them a paper and you pay a fee of €800, it will appear online in print the next day. But of course, the devil's in the detail there, isn't it? Because it's not necessarily the best vehicle to publish your much cherished piece of research. So simply getting something published doesn't necessarily mean it's going to give you an awful lot of credit. There is a move, nevertheless, to make most publications first of all, print free, so it's online only, and secondly, to make it free for everybody to access. And that is, I suspect, just the way that most publications are going. Now, the downside to that is if nobody's going to pay to access a particular research journal, then that cost is going to have to be recouped at some stage by someone. And that's normally the person who's submitting the paper. Now, most reputable journals will review your paper and accept it, and only then charge you a fee, but that should be a relatively modest one for the work or the cost that it's included. Of course, if you're a fellow or member or affiliate of the Royal College of Surgeons, then the Annals is clearly a very good option to you, because that's a perk for the affiliate members and the fellows of the college. I'm not plugging that one too heavily, am I? No.
Merely informing them.
Subtle, yeah, I thought that was. Yes, so that is a problem. So someone's written in, and I've been asked to make some changes to a paper I've submitted, but don't agree with the suggested changes. What do I do? Well, I think we mentioned this briefly, and the honest answer is that the people who have reviewed your paper very often are experts in their field. There are a number of reviewers who will have seen your paper. There is inevitably then an associate editor who would have looked at all those comments, and finally an editor which would have looked at those comments as well. And so if someone has suggested making some changes, they have normally come from several people. I think if you feel very unhappy about a particular change, then I think you argue your case and say, well, I think this lessens the paper or changes the meaning. And I think most journals will be very happy to reconsider. But for the large part, if a change has been suggested, it's normally because a group of your peers have suggested that the paper would be improved. So nothing's final. You can appeal, but ultimately I think the changes are made because people think it will be a better paper and reflect better on you ultimately if they're made. My paper has been rejected. I hope it wasn't the Annals. Can I appeal the decision? You can appeal the decision. Normally the editor-in-chief's decision is final. But I think if you've felt slightly hard done by, then the answer is email in the journal. And I think most editors would be happy to perhaps explain to you the reason or relook at it. Occasionally mistakes do happen. And so I think a polite email and a request is perfectly reasonable.
I'd say ask for feedback then, don't ask for...
Yeah, no feedback as well. Yeah, I think that will help. So what does an editor look for in deciding whether a paper will be published? It's a number of factors. If you think back to the case report I submitted 20 years ago, there were lots of papers or case reports about wandering spleens. Virtually all of them were about patients who presented with infarcted spleens because they had torted on their pedicle and the management was essentially a splenectomy. I think what the editor looked for at the time when I published that simple case report was there was a management aspect. Beforehand, there was something novel about this. It was, how do you manage this? Because up to then, there wasn't a management protocol. And so this was something new. This was something you could share. And to a certain extent as well, whilst most of the published papers on wandering spleens had put in CT images and things like that, there was quite a good photograph, which we took at the time. It shows you what it looks like. And so there's a degree of appeal there as well. It's not always about what's most rare. There is, dare I say, a little bit of entertainment factor in there as well. So this is going to be interesting to readers and it's going to be informative. Those are normally the things that editors look for, as well as something that's going to be significant and ultimately be quoted and improve the impact factor of your journal. Next question is, do you have any tips on how to write a paper in an efficient way, particularly if the subject matter is unfamiliar? What would you say to that, Alex?
I'd say become familiar with it. You can't write a paper on something you don't know. We're not asking random people on the street what their opinion is on the topic. We're asking for decisive information and a decent publication from this. And if you don't know what you're talking about, it will come across in your paper very clearly.
Hardline response from Alex. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a good opportunity to know more about the topic, because you do a bit of a background read, a bit of a literature review, and you can write a good introduction as to what you're doing. But ultimately, you need to write a paper, an academic paper, which is normally about some research you've undertaken. The subject is important, but what you've done is more important. So it needs to be read by someone who's not an expert in the field and can understand it as well. So you need to use that type of language when you're writing. So don't worry about it and read up, do your literature review, and I think it's something which you can learn from.
And I think if you look through the slides about writing your abstract, introduction, method, results, and discussion, if you stick to those criteria, I think that's the best way you can do of getting through the paper. So we're coming towards the end now, and I think we're just going to begin to round off. Any more questions, or shall we move on to one more question? We've got time for one more question. So what are the common pitfalls that may prevent medical students from getting their papers published? I suspect it's an amalgam of everything we've been talking about. It's being a medical student per se doesn't mean that your paper will be viewed any less seriously than any other paper. But I think often an awful lot of effort's gone into writing a paper, but most of the papers fall because either they don't conform to a particular journal style, or they submit the paper to the wrong type of journal. I think there's a feeling that this is a great paper, it's going to get published. And the real problem is it can be a great paper, but it won't be published unless you've written it in an appropriate style and submitted it to the right journal. Did either of you write any papers as medical students?
No,
it's I have to say,
good medical students who came to me as part of their BSc projects, and they had the support of having an academic unit behind them. And I think what a lot of medical students lack is that support from a senior author who can guide them. Most medical students are bright to begin with. So I
was going to say, we've had medical students come to us and they've had their papers published, no problems at all. Yeah. It's just about having that support, because as a medical student, you don't know what they're looking for, and that's why you ask for help.
I think if you are on a firm as a medical student, go and speak to your foundation trainee or the registrars. It's a perfect opportunity for you to get involved. Anyway, we're going to have to wind up slowly. There's people behind the screen going like that to me, so that means I'm assuming that means I've got to wind up in a minute. I'm just going to put in a few shameless plugs for some upcoming webinars. One is by Tim Mitchell on the 7th of November. I suspect this is going to be of interest to a large number of more senior surgeons. So go and tell your boss that Tim Mitchell's doing a job planning webinar on the 7th of November. You may have to tell him how to show him how to log in, because he doesn't know, but he'll be very impressed if you show him. And something that I think a lot more of you may be interested in, and that's interview skills, and that's something we could all benefit from. And that's due to be run. We haven't got a date yet in December, so I would certainly log back in December to get some pointers on interview skills. But for now, I'm very grateful for everybody joining us. If you're a senior fellow, you can come along later on this year for a meeting. But otherwise, we're going to sign off now. But thank you very much for joining us. Bye for now.